In the autumn of 1994, a senior executive at Sumitomo Bank, Kazufumi Hata, stepped out of his apartment in Nagoya and was shot directly between the eyes. He was not a drug dealer, a politician, or a spy. He was a banker tasked with cleaning up hundreds of millions of dollars in toxic real estate loans following the collapse of Japan's economic bubble. In the mid-1990s, Japan's banking system was sitting on an estimated $1 trillion in non-performing loans. What the public did not know, and what financial regulators were terrified to admit, was that up to 40% of those bad debts were tied directly to organized crime. Kazufumi Hata was not the first high-ranking financial executive to pay with his life for attempting to recover Yakuza loans, nor would he be the last. 2 years earlier, in September 1994, Shitaro Akiyama, the manager of Sumitomo Bank's Nagoya branch, opened his front door to a gunman who put a bullet through his head. In the months surrounding these killings, homes of bank executives were firebombed, corporate boardrooms received packages containing live bullets, and over 20 separate attacks targeted financial institutions attempting to audit non-performing loans. The terror was systematic, designed to enforce a vow of absolute silence across the financial sector. But the violence was only a smokescreen. The real objective was not merely to scare off bank auditors. It was to buy time while the syndicates executed one of the largest fraudulent wealth transfers in modern economic history. To understand how deep this systemic rot extended, investigators had to unpack the structural disaster of the Jusen companies, specialized housing loan corporations created by major commercial banks. Throughout the 1980s, when real estate prices spiraled into fantasy, these entities funneled trillions of yen into speculative land deals. When the bubble burst, the Jusen were left holding over $100 billion in non-performing loans. What Japanese authorities kept quiet for years was that an estimated 40% of those toxic loans were tied directly to Yakuza front companies, known as JITEC. The syndicates had used fake identity networks and shell corporations to secure billions in unbacked loans, creating a web of artificial debt designed to collapse once the cash was safely diverted. When regulators finally attempted to repossess these defaulted properties, they encountered an insurmountable wall. Yakuza enforcers simply occupied the buildings, establishing physical squatters' rights while threatening bank executives with public exposure of their own illicit kickbacks. Japanese financial institutions found themselves trapped in a deadlock of their own making, unable to foreclose on delinquent assets without exposing the systemic rot inside their own boardrooms. This toxic symbiosis was not a sudden aberration born of the bubble economy. It was the culmination of a decades-long practices centered on a specialized class of Yakuza operatives known as sakeya. These corporate racketeers had long transformed the mundane requirement of an annual general shareholder meeting into a calculated, highly lucrative extortion racket. By purchasing a single share of stock, sakeya earned the legal right to attend annual shareholder meetings. From there, the playbook was simple yet devastatingly effective. They amassed intelligence on executive infidelities, off-the-books bribes, and hidden corporate losses, threatening to publicize these embarrassments during live proceedings. To avoid disruption, major Japanese corporations realized a dark truth. Paying off a single sakeya operative was far cheaper than risking a PR disaster. But what began as quiet hush-money payments quickly inverted into a far more dangerous dynamic. Corporations did not just pay the sakeya to shut them up. They began hiring specific syndicate-backed sakeya to silence rival extortionists and police their own shareholders. Japan's top brokerages, including financial giants like Nomura, Daiwa, and Nikko Securities, were secretly funneling hundreds of millions of yen into underworld accounts. They provided guaranteed compensation on stock investments for syndicate bosses, absorbing market losses directly out of corporate funds, while ordinary retail investors carried the risk. But stock manipulation was merely the foundation of the leverage the syndicates were quietly accumulating. By the mid-1980s, Japan's real estate asset bubble was inflating at a feverish, unprecedented pace, and the Yakuza realized that their true path to systemic power lay not in corporate extortion, but in the physical soil of Tokyo and Osaka. To fuel the real estate boom, property developers needed to consolidate thousands of tiny parcels of land owned by stubborn, generational homeowners who refused to sell. Legitimate corporate developers could not risk the public relations nightmare of forced evictions or prolonged legal battles that could stall projects for years while interest rates fluctuated. Enter the Jaya, specialized land-clearing operatives who served as the indispensable bridge between Sutentai corporate boardrooms and the criminal underworld. Syndicate bosses deployed teams of enforcers to systematically torment property owners until they broke. Driveway entrances were blocked by heavy machinery. Trucks dumped tons of rotting industrial waste outside residential doorways. Venomous snakes were surreptitiously released into front yards, and middle-of-the-night phone calls brought relentless, chilling threats of violence. Yet the true revelation was not the terror inflicted on the street, but the identities of those funding it. Investigative disclosures following the bubble's collapse revealed that Japan's premier commercial banks, securities houses, and real estate conglomerates were not merely turning a blind eye to these tactics. They were directly financing them. Tier 1 financial institutions regularly wired hundreds of millions of yen directly to Yakuza front companies, fully aware that the money was earmarked for coercive land acquisition. The syndicates were no longer operating on the margins of Japanese capitalism. They had become the muscle driving its primary growth engine. But land clearance was merely the entry point. What happened when the banks began accepting that very same inflated land as collateral for even larger, unbacked loans? By the late 1980s, Yakuza leaders recognized a fundamental vulnerability in the Japanese banking structure. Financial institutions, blinded by the myth that Japanese land values would never fall, began granting billions of yen in unsecured loans to mob-backed shell corporations. The Yakuza did not just exploit the system, they systematically engineered a secondary lending market. As legitimate banks reached their regulatory limits on real estate lending, they funneled vast capital into non-bank housing loan companies known as jusen. These jusen operated with almost zero regulatory oversight. Yakuza front companies, known as corporate racketeers or JIA, borrowed hundreds of billions from these specialized lenders, using a single parcel of land as collateral for multiple, escalating loans from different institutions. By the time the Japanese asset price bubble burst in 1991, the jusen were left holding over $300 billion in non-performing loans. Official government investigations would later confirm a staggering reality. At least 30 to 40% of all bad loans in the entire Japanese financial sector were directly tied to organized crime syndicates. The mob had effectively carried out the largest bank robbery in human history without ever pulling a gun inside a branch. But the real crisis began when the government attempted to clean up the mess. When liquidators and bank auditors tried to repossess property tied to Yakuza loans, they collided with a wall of violent intimidation. Property developers who attempted to clear mob-backed tenants found arson attacks at their offices and bullet holes in their front doors. In 1993, the vice president of Sumitomo Bank, Kazugoro Yamazaki, was shot dead outside his home in Nagoya after trying to collect on defaulted Yakuza-linked real estate loans. 1 year later, Tomasaburo Kuranushi, a senior director at Fuji Bank, was found murdered in a similar fashion. These were not random acts of violence. They were calculated public executions meant to send a chilling message to the entire financial establishment. Do not attempt to collect on our debts. The strategy worked. Terrified bank officials stopped pursuing foreclosures, effectively freezing the Japanese banking system for a decade. The non-performing loan crisis deepened into what economists call Japan's lost decade, funded and prolonged by organized crime. Yet, while the financial authorities were paralyzed by fear, an even darker question emerged. Why were Japan's top corporate executives so willing to pay off the Yakuza, even when they weren't being threatened at gunpoint? The answer lay in a uniquely Japanese institutional vice known as sakeya. For decades, major Japanese corporations prioritized harmony, public image, and absolute consensus above all else. The Yakuza identified this cultural vulnerability and weaponized it through corporate blackmail. Sakeya operatives would buy a small number of shares in a targeted public company, just enough to give them the legal right to attend the annual general shareholder meeting. They would then deploy investigative teams to uncover corporate scandals, executive infidelities, illegal accounting practices, or insider trading secrets. Instead of going to the press, the sakeya approached corporate boards with a simple proposition. Pay us massive consulting fees, buy our overpriced magazines, or hire our security firms, and we will keep your board meeting quiet. If a company refused to pay, dozens of intimidating mobsters in dark suits would show up at the annual general meeting. They would shout abuse, ask humiliating questions about executive misconduct, and disrupt proceedings for hours on end. In Japan's honor-bound corporate culture, the resulting public disgrace could destroy a CEO's career in a single afternoon. To avoid this public humiliation, Japan's elite corporations chose compliance over confrontation. Companies like Nomura Securities, Daiwa Securities, Mitsubishi Motors, and even household brands like Kirin Brewery and Ajinomoto were eventually revealed to have paid millions of dollars in illicit payoffs to Sakeya organizations. The practice was so pervasive that, by the late 1980s, corporate executives actively coordinated with Yakuza bosses to keep annual general meetings as brief as possible. Mobsters were paid to physically intimidate legitimate shareholders into silence, allowing corporate leaders to pass resolutions without debate. At its peak, hundreds of major Japanese corporations held their annual shareholder meetings on the exact same day, at the exact same time, deliberately to divide the attention of the Sakeya, a practice that persisted for decades and illustrated just how completely organized crime had hijacked the mechanics of Japanese capitalism. Yet, as lucrative as corporate extortion was inside Tokyo, the Yakuza's leaders realized that domestic wealth was vulnerable to local enforcement. To safeguard their assets, they began executing an aggressive international expansion strategy, transforming domestic syndicates into global criminal conglomerates. The primary destination for this wealth flight was the United States, specifically Hawaii and California. Using vast networks of legitimate-looking real estate holdings and shell companies based in tax havens like the Cayman Islands, high-ranking bosses from the Yamaguchi-gumi and Inagawa-kai syndicates began purchasing luxury high-rise condos, oceanfront resorts, and premier golf courses across the Hawaiian Islands. To American sellers, these buyer groups appeared to be straightforward Japanese investment firms paying far above market value in cash. In reality, these foreign assets served a dual purpose: laundering billions in drug and extortion profits while establishing fixed logistics hubs on American soil. By the mid-1990s, federal law enforcement agencies in the United States realized that the Yakuza was no longer just buying land. They were building an international trafficking corridor. In Las Vegas, high-rolling Yakuza bosses used commercial casinos to launder millions through high-stakes baccarat tables, converting dirty yen into clean United States Treasury checks. In California, Yakuza syndicates partnered with local street gangs and Asian American criminal networks to establish sophisticated weapon smuggling pipelines. Military-grade firearms, automatic rifles, and specialized explosive ordnance were bought in the United States, loaded into commercial shipping containers disguised as imported machinery, and shipped directly into Japanese ports controlled by Yakuza-affiliated dock companies. In exchange for American weaponry, the Yakuza exported synthetic drugs. Methamphetamine, known domestically in Japan as shabu, had been controlled by mob syndicates since the post-war era. As demand for synthetic stimulants surged across East Asia and the Pacific Rim, the Yakuza transformed meth production into a multinational enterprise. Production facilities were established across Southeast Asia and Korea to meet growing demand, with profits funneled through front businesses in Honolulu, Vancouver, and Los Angeles. Hawaii, in particular, became a critical staging ground. To the average tourist, the Hawaiian Islands were a paradise of luxury resorts and scenic beaches. But to federal investigators in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Hawaii had become the central transshipment node for a massive trans-Pacific criminal conduit. Japanese syndicates purchased vast swaths of commercial property, residential real estate, and night spots across Oahu, using these assets to launder illicit drug money while simultaneously establishing safe houses for high-ranking bosses seeking a base outside the jurisdiction of the National Police Agency in Tokyo. Federal authorities soon realized that this was not merely a passive real estate investment strategy. It was an active operational hub. American law enforcement agencies, including the DEA and FBI, began uncovering routine shipments of high-grade firearms, ranging from handguns to assault rifles and explosives, smuggled out of West Coast ports, hidden within imported cars or shipping containers, and destined for the streets of Tokyo and Osaka. In exchange, pure crystalline methamphetamine flowed back into North America. But that alarming trade in contraband was only a symptom of a far more sophisticated financial expansion already underway. As the 1980s dawned, the world witnessed the meteoric rise of the Japanese bubble economy. Stock prices soared, real estate valuations in Tokyo reached astronomical heights, and Japanese corporations began acquiring iconic assets across the globe. What was hidden from international observers at the time was the extent to which organized crime was driving and capitalizing on this economic phenomenon. The traditional boundaries between illicit street enforcement and high finance vanished. Yakuza leadership realized that muscle and intimidation were far more lucrative when applied to real estate development, stock manipulation, and corporate finance than to neighborhood protection rackets. At the absolute center of this financial infiltration was a man named Suzumu Ishii, the visionary leader of the Inagawa-kai, one of Japan's 3 largest crime syndicates. Ishii understood that raw cash was vulnerable to law enforcement seizure, but capital integrated into the global financial architecture was virtually invincible. Under his direction, the Inagawa-kai systematically penetrated Japan's financial sector. The syndicate began acquiring massive stakes in public companies, leveraging their corporate holdings to secure billions of dollars in loans from major Japanese financial institutions. These weren't shadow banks operating in the dark. They were top-tier, government-regulated financial houses and real estate firms. Institutions like Nomura Securities and Nikko Securities, 2 of the largest stock brokerages in the world, actively facilitated transactions for Ishii's syndicate. Hundreds of millions of dollars were funneled into Ishii-controlled shell companies to buy shares in public corporations, inflate stock values artificially, and then dump the shares at maximum profit. Yet, the true scale of this systemic corruption only emerged when the syndicate turned its eyes toward the United States. Using the staggering capital reserves generated by their domestic financial maneuvers, Yakuza-linked entities began purchasing prestigious American real estate, including golf courses, hotel chains, and commercial developments across California, Nevada, and Hawaii. In one of the most high-profile transactions of the era, a Yakuza-backed businessman named Minoru Isutani acquired the world-famous Pebble Beach golf links in California for nearly $800 million, funded by capital linked directly to organized crime networks. To Western regulators, these appeared to be legitimate corporate investments by aggressive foreign firms. In reality, the Japanese underworld was successfully embedding its illicit capital into the bedrock of American commercial real estate. Yet, while financial engineering provided vast wealth, the syndicates retained their primary weapon of influence: institutional fear. This was achieved through a uniquely Japanese form of corporate extortion known as sakeya. Sakeya racketeers were specialized covert operatives associated with the Yakuza who purchased nominal shares in major blue-chip corporations. By acquiring just enough shares to attend annual general shareholder meetings, these operatives gained the right to ask questions and review corporate books. They did not use this access for shareholder advocacy. Instead, sakeya operatives conducted exhaustive investigations into the private lives of corporate executives and the hidden financial improprieties of the firms themselves. They discovered secret off-the-book slush funds, systemic tax evasion, unsafe manufacturing practices, and personal scandals involving chief executives. Once compromising material was secured, the Yakuza presented corporate boards with a simple ultimatum: pay millions of dollars in consulting fees or public relations retainers, or face catastrophic public humiliation during the annual shareholder meeting. For decades, Japan's corporate elite quietly acquiesced. Top-tier banks, automobile manufacturers, tech conglomerates, and retail giants regularly paid out millions of dollars to Yakuza front organizations to ensure their annual general meetings ran smoothly without public disruption. Executive boards viewed these payments not as extortion, but as a routine cost of doing business, an insurance policy to protect corporate reputation and maintain executive secrecy. when certain courageous corporate leaders attempted to break the cycle and cut off payments. The response from the underworld was swift and deadly. In the early